Hi again, everyone. Nearly every year for the past decade, but I've lost count. It seems I can't find the files on my computer anymore. I've agreed to give this talk on a subject that is near and dear to my heart, Darwin Day, or as it's now evolved, rebranded, I guess is a better term, to be known by its originator, Michael Zimmerman, Religion and Science Weekend. This is easy to do well in advance. I think I once agreed before the talk of 1 year to give the talk the following year, but I'm doing it at a time in my life, I'm retired now, where it interjects stress when I'm not supposed to have stress. And surprisingly, I get nervous every time. But then I'm reminded of the advice that I used to give my students, which was, say yes, and it's easy to do a year in advance, show up, and do things that are hard. So here I am. Every year I also do quite a bit of hand-wringing over whether I've covered something in these past talks, because there's a certain amount of necessary redundancy that might occur. And then I sort of think, well, did I tell that joke? Did I cover that subject? Did I do that reading? And then I realize that if I can't remember, it's pretty likely you don't either. If anybody is watching old presentations and notes things, I don't want to know about it because you need a new hobby. So, okay. So we're going to pretend none of this happened before. Okay, explanations. There are explanations that we naturally seek as humans. I think it's fair to say that it is probably something that's unique to humans, or at least it's best developed in humans. And I think it's very much related to the way that we process and evaluate time. Of course, there's always a here and now. Religions try to get us to return to being in the here and now. But what humans evolved as something that I refer to as an ability to temporalize. And this means that it allows us to look forward in time and back in time. As we look to the present and think about things that happened in the past, our ancestors of the past, pre-science, possibly even pre-tool use, naturally gravitated to supernatural explanations. It's really all they had available to them. And extending that ability to temporalize, they look to the future to see the things that they might do to ensure something positive or avoid something negative from occurring. I think what this also contributed to in the broader sense was tool use. So I think it's a natural extension to see a thing, a task, look in the past about how the task happened, and look into the future about an object, and then be able to temporalize in that way. So because of seeking these explanations and trying to affect the future, we end up with practices like sacrifice, which serves as an attempt to gain some kind of a favor for the supernatural forces. It's a fairly short step, I think, to personifying those forces, presumably usually in our own image, but not always. Unfortunately, it's also another short step for some enterprising person to convince the populace that they and only they can communicate with the powers that be, and thus the priesthood is born, but that's a subject for a different talk. It took many millennia for us to come up with some different approach to explaining the world, and even among some of the great scientists and philosophers, there were barriers. One fairly famous barrier came from none other than Plato, the great Greek philosopher, who actively disparaged the accuracy of human senses in what is known as the allegory of the cave. Now, according to this allegory that appeared in the Republic, the human ability to understand using only our senses is no better than a prisoner or a set of prisoners who are chained in such a way that they can see a wall of a cave, and all the input they have is cast by a fire behind them and people holding puppets. So it's a very shadowy view of the world. And according to philosophers of science, they claim that this helped establish, and to some extent dominate our thinking, with the concept of essentialism, meaning that renders human science or human senses either unreliable or incapable of appreciating the true essence of the world. And of course, if our senses aren't reliable, how can we really expect it to explain anything? Now, other Greeks countered this, most particularly Plato's most famous student, Aristotle. He made many observations of nature, but after Greece, fall of Rome, and the onset of the Dark Ages, his work, which survived by basically circling the Mediterranean, was rediscovered, so to speak. And ironically, after its rediscovery, it was treated as almost a sacred document. It was said that if you wanted to know in the 12th century or so how many teeth a horse had, you'd go look it up in Aristotle. Nobody would ever have thought to go look at the mouth of a horse. So it seems that humans are vulnerable to influence by authority, whether it's a priest, a non-religious sacred text, or, for that matter, Google. Intellectual laziness? Perhaps. I know I'm prone to it myself. Now, it has been claimed by some that science and religion are engaged in some kind of a zero-sum game when it comes to explaining natural phenomena, something that's sometimes referred to as the god of the gaps. The ancients thought thunder was the galloping of the gods. Then we figured out expansion of superheated air by massive static electricity of lightning is the cause. Apologies if that's a spoiler for anybody in here. And then there's a tendency to think that once we apply that cold ability to reason to explaining the world, that it somehow makes it less magical. My first response to that was, well, of course not. But I had to admit, when I was considering the talk, I had trouble asking myself, why do I think that? Then a friend, Tim Hirsch, asked me a question. This was a few weeks ago. He said, why do people still appreciate beauty if it doesn't advance our evolutionary position? And I had to say, well, and Tim, if that wasn't the question you asked me, be quiet and I'll buy you dinner, because that's the one I'm going with. It's a perfectly legitimate question, and it's kind of a personal challenge because of some coldness I feel inside of me. The cold scientist weighs in first and says, well, perhaps it's insufficiently maladaptive to affect reproductive success. How's that for the world's worst pickup line? That's a statement that's going to win you a lot of friends in the bowling alley. Now, what it means is that you still have kids even if you believe that, basically. So, But anyway, it opens up also to me one of the stereotypes in movies and things that annoys me the most. There's a famous scene in a movie like Contact, but there are many you can point to, where the scientist is challenged by the sensitive romanticist to, well, then if you're so cold, then explain love. Well, the scientist is, of course, unable to grasp the mystical storyline and comes off looking pretty bad. When I was doing all this pondering, I said, wait, maybe I'm that guy. Nobody wants to be that guy. And then I realized that maybe the problem for this is the concept of certainty. How can we, or I, be certain or so sure of anything? Then I started pondering, well, what am I sure about? Well, there are things I am sure about. I'm certain that every living thing on Earth is related by common ancestry, and it's taken over 3 billion years for us to get to this point. Now, that's some information from my training that led me to become a foot soldier in the culture wars of the so-called creation science movement of the 80s and 90s. Later on, I thought that I was certain that there was no God. But then in 2006, some of you might remember this, a group of atheist activists, yes, apparently it was a thing, who called themselves the Rational Response Squad, issued something to the world called the Blasphemy Challenge. In this challenge, they gave out books to the first 1,001 people who would make a personal video disavowing the existence of the Holy Spirit, which, according to the Gospel of Mark 3:29-28, reads, "Truly I tell you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. They are guilty of an eternal sin." So it's considered to be the one unforgivable sin. And I said, hey, no problem. Couldn't do it. Just couldn't do it. Had to ask myself, why not? Well, it could have been residual imprinting from Catholic upbringing. That obviously has persistence. Those of you who are raised Catholic know that. It could have been Pascal's wager, which, if you're not familiar with, it says that in a square diagram with 4 boxes, if you believe in God and there is a God, you're saved. If you believe in a God and there is no God, no harm, no foul. If you don't believe in a God and there is no God, no difference. If you don't believe in a God and there is a God, then you're in bad shape. Or it could possibly be the influence of my late wife, who was a religious studies major, and she was fond of pointing out, if you have any doubt whatsoever of the existence of God, then you're not really an atheist, technically you're an agnostic. Well, these are still things I'm pondering. But as I was doing all this pondering in preparation for the talk, something else happened. I was quizzing some friends about these thoughts and ideas about certainty and such. And I was visiting my friends in Montreal, and one of my dearest old friends is a fellow named David. He and his wife have a film production company in Montreal. He is as avowed an atheist as I know. He's also partly indigenous, but he's not really connected to the community. But he was recently filming as a reservation in northern Manitoba at a ceremony where the tribe was honoring ancestors. And he was interviewing an elder, and he kept calling her by the wrong name. And the woman asked him why he was. She kept catching him. He said he didn't really know. But then the elder said, well, that's my sister's name. And she's here, but she's no longer living. And I'm getting chills doing it right now. It shook him, and it shakes me to this day. Now, the true rationalist would just say, well, chalk this up to coincidence. And there are books that have been written about how people can believe crazy things. But does the cold scientist always win out? I just didn't feel like a cold scientist. And then it hit me. My way out of the blind alley of certainty is through curiosity. Curiosity, for me, leads to exploration, which leads to discovery, which leads to awe. And curiosity is something that's always driven me and all the scientists that I know. To repeat a passage from the first reading, to the real scientist, a question that has been answered becomes not less wonderful, but more so. Increased understanding increases scientific awe, and most great scientists have named awe of this kind as their deepest reason for pursuing science at all. Now, once I had this little revelation for myself, as a result of these considerations, I went out onto the web and discovered a trove of great reading from which today's were selected. It was all out there, I just hadn't personally discovered it yet. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't connect this in some way to Darwin, since we are still calling this Darwin Day. All these 18th and 19th century, particularly Sir Isaac Newton, who we proposed, and a lot of other of those readings were from scientists in that era. They lived in a different time and with a different set of assumptions about explaining the natural world. I've had the privilege several times of attending sets of talks in the hall where Darwin's theory of his mechanism of evolution, natural selection, was first read in public. It's a place called the Linnaean Society, and it's in London. It was read alongside Alfred Russel Wallace, who also hit upon the same idea. And it's an imposing room, made all the more so by the fact that the famous Darwin as an old man portrait overlooks the room. The talk was given on July 1st, 1858. Currently, there is a lectern, and there are rows of benches, much like this, that are facing the lectern, and people speak. But in 1858, the rows were oriented differently. In 1858, the lectern was here, and there were 2 rows down each side longitudinally in the room. On the one side were the eminent scientists of the Linnaean Society, and on the other side were the theologians. Yes, in those days, the clergy were deeply involved in discussions of science and causation. And what Darwin feared most when he read his talk, he didn't actually read it, but was not the criticism of his scientific peers. It was the ruthless public censure that would result if he were labeled a philosophical materialist. In other words, that his explanation did not require God to exist. Now, these days, I can safely ponder such questions in public without risking my career. I have the luxury of being able to choose to be a materialist. Now, does this answer Tim's question? Well, no, I have some possible answers, but they all sound really clinical. I don't want to go down that dark alley just yet. But I'm going to close with some more words from Albert Einstein. This was read in front of the German League of Human Rights in 1932. The most beautiful and deepest experience a person can have is the sense of the mysterious. It is the underlying principle of religion, as well as of all serious endeavors in art and science. The one who never had this experience seems to me, if not dead, then at least blind. the sense that behind anything that can be experienced, there is a something that our mind cannot grasp, and whose beauty and sublimity reaches us only indirectly and as feeble reflection. This is religiousness. In this sense, I am religious. To me, it suffices to wonder at these secrets and to attempt humbly to grasp with my mind a mere image of the lofty structure of all that there is. Thanks.